Welcome to Star Wars Action News, helping Star Wars collectors collect better.
Hello, Star Wars Action News listeners. This is Nathan P. Butler of the Star Wars Timeline Gold, Star Wars Beyond the Films, etc., etc. Here with your, I guess you'd call this an Expanding the Universe report or an EU report, but I guess we can't really use that terminology anymore, can we? I'm here to help celebrate the 10th anniversary of Star Wars Action News, so a couple of notes of congratulations first. First off, Arnie, Marjorie, the rest of the team, congratulations on 10 years of Star Wars Action News. It has been an outstanding podcast, and I got to say, you guys, I remember back when I first ran into the show when I was putting together StarWarsFanWorks.com back when it was more of a directory than it is now, and thinking, who's this guy? He's doing it with his wife? And what is this show? To now, really, you have built Star Wars Action News into what I think is probably the single strongest Star Wars podcast in the entire Star Wars podcasting community. Reaching out beyond it in terms of other shows, but putting together a quality product week after week, going into a great deal of depth, gathering around a team of experts in different areas to really create a show that stands out in a way that you would imagine it being the type of thing that you could get on a paid Star Wars radio network or something. I mean, really something special, and you guys should be very proud of that at this point. And I don't just say that because I get to do segments from time to time on the show. This really has been a fantastic series to watch grow over the last decade. Speaking of congratulations, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Arnie, if he is perhaps too modest to mention it, though hopefully he will on the show. Arnie has had a chance to write for Life Stories Movie Magic magazine. He has a fantastic article in here on Star Wars collecting. Now, there's other Star Wars writers who are in this too. Rich Handley's in it. I'm in it. But when it comes to just kind of the sheer depth of knowledge of Star Wars collecting, the only person that made sense to bring into this, to do an article on Star Wars collecting, was Arnie. And he does a fantastic job talking about the collecting in the lead up to The Force Awakens. So kudos on that too. Congratulations on an official magazine article being published about Star Wars from Arnie's end here. You guys haven't seen a lot of me recently in terms of Star Wars Action News because I guess my focus has sort of changed, and I've actually taken up collecting something new over the last few years, which has been Star Wars on home video. So I've picked up a YouTube series I do now called From the Star Wars Home Video Library, which you can find, I guess it's youtube.com/user/chronoradio. But basically been doing shows on this stuff, which is a little bit different. And I guess my collecting has always been a little bit odd for segments on the show because I don't tend to collect the toys or the memorabilia in a lot of ways. I tend to collect the stories in most respects, comics, novels, and things like that. In that sense, being a lot like Brock when it comes to collecting those things. So I wanted to sort of take a moment here as we were talking about possible ideas for segments here for the 10th anniversary and give us sort of a state of Star Wars when it comes to story collectors, those of us who collect novels, comics, and such, and what does this change that happened over the last year to year and a half from legends to canon mean for people like us? Sort of an end cap or an epilogue to a series on story collecting that I did many, many, many years ago for Star Wars Action News. Now again, the idea here is that the Star Wars Legends continuity, what used to be just the official continuity that built from 1991 up to 2014, included eventually a lot of the older stuff from the 70s and 80s. That continuity has sort of been cut off for the most part. It's expanding in the form of things like the Old Republic MMO video games still, but for the most part, that continuity and its expansion has more or less come to a close. And in its place, we have a new canon dictated by the story group through Lucasfilm in which everything is meant to be even. No more of this G canon, C canon, T canon kind of slid there in the middle down to S canon, N canon, and all that, all those different levels. That's gone. Instead, everything is canon. It's supposed to be on par with the films in terms of how true it is for the Star Wars universe, though we'll see how long that lasts and what happens when we start to see things that contradict the films popping up in other media. But for now, the idea is it's all just as real as everything else. And that meant basically a reboot of the Star Wars continuity, starting with just the films and the Clone Wars. Now we've got Rebels added into the mix, new novels, new comics, and so forth, that are creating this alternate, more official version of the Star Wars saga. So for someone collecting the novels, Heir to the Empire is no longer the first of the current continuity to be released. Instead, it's John Jackson Miller's A New Dawn. The first official comics of the new continuity are no longer Dark Empire with Dark Empire #1 from 1991. Nope, now it's Star Wars from Marvel Comics. Well, the new Star Wars from Marvel Comics, coming after they finally regained the license after for years it being at Dark Horse. Welcome home! As if it was something they earned. It's kind of a fait accompli, wasn't it? Disney owning Marvel. But the jump has been made from Dark Horse to Marvel. Although, I would note here that Darth Maul's Son of Dathomir, being based on old Clone Wars scripts that were unproduced, those actually got carried over with the Clone Wars into canon, so technically they're the first comics of the new canon, though Marvel gets a lot of the credit and all the fanfare for doing so. Now, in both of those cases, comics and novels, for a story collector, things have sort of shifted in that there is a definitive cutoff point now between the old continuity and the new. So someone who is collecting all of it, for a long time the idea was, well, I gotta just keep collecting, right? Whatever it is you collect, whether it's first editions, hardbacks, paperbacks, just getting one of each story, it was always this whole idea of the completionist coming out inside of us and we had to have more, all of it. Well, for a while there, the idea was that if it keeps growing, there will never be an end to it, will there? All of it will mean continuing to have to buy things. Well, now someone who is a story collector of the Legends continuity could choose to say, I want all of it, and it's done being expanded, so I'm cutting off, and I'm only buying Legends stuff. I'm not picking up anything new. Whereas someone who saw the expanded universe and the Legends continuity as extremely intimidating with so many novels and comics out there, so they didn't get into collecting it, can instead now step back and say, you know what? I don't need to worry about that. The true canon, so to speak, is this new stuff, so I can start with the New Dawn. I can start with Marvel's new comics, and I'll be able to pick up on the ground floor of something new and actually get all of it. So from a collecting standpoint, it's allowed for an interesting new end point and beginning point into this idea of jumping into collecting Star Wars novels and comics. You don't have to necessarily have everything. You can have one or the other if you choose to. Now, two side notes here really quickly on comics. There's the argument of, well, I don't want to pick up the stuff from canon because, man, it's not real. The old stuff was the real stuff. I don't want to be collecting multiple continuities of stuff. It's a valid point for those who are worried about Legends being forgotten and those who prefer Legends over the new canon. That's great. But if you collected all the comics and such before, you would have collected stuff like this too, right? Star Wars Infinities? So to a degree, we've been collecting alternate universes in the past anyway. It's just that now the alternate universe is all that old stuff that we collected, and the true universe, so to speak, is the new stuff. But there have been instances of alternate universes before. We just have to broaden our minds to a degree if we choose to. More on the choice aspect in a moment. We also should keep in mind that this is Marvel now for comics, not Dark Horse. Dark Horse would do some variant covers every great once in a while. Most recently, they did a ton of variant covers for Star Wars Volume 2, #1 from Brian Wood. When it comes to variant covers, though, Marvel seems to be the king at this point in that. Star Wars #1, thanks to the fact that it had multiple variant covers and had a deal going, as Marvel does, where basically if you're a retailer, a comic shop, and you order enough copies of a particular issue, you could actually have a special variant made just for your store by your chosen artist. Marvel's Star Wars #1 had over 100 variants for one issue. And then brag about how they just sold the greatest number that they ever have in this particular limited amount of time, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, because a lot of people are out there buying multiple covers, and you had 100+ covers out there for one. It was a great selling issue. It sort of diluted their numbers, though, and the ability to really stand tall on that, though, by the fact that they had so many freaking variants out there. But suffice to say, you'll find stuff out there like the director's cut issues with sketches that give you some new content in here, and tons and tons and tons of variant covers. There has so far not been a single issue, to my knowledge, of any Marvel Star Wars comics in this new canon that have been released that haven't had variant covers. So, welcome to that, if you're a Star Wars comic collector. If you care about variants, now there are more to collect. A lot of them are specific to individual comic shops. Collecting them has become that much harder. But there's more to collect if you like the chase. For those following home video, like me, honestly, that really hasn't changed. The Star Wars films are still being re-released again and again in different formats or in different packaging, and the TV show, Rebels, is now having its releases come out, but very much like what we saw with the Clone Wars. So for a story collector or a home video collector, pretty much it's all just status quo at this point. Though we're still waiting on some 3D versions on Blu-ray of the films we know have been redone in 3D, the prequels. It's actually in games where things have really changed for us story collectors in a large degree, aside from just giving us a cutoff point or a beginning point. Gone are the days when things like The Force Unleashed, great series like that, or crap like Star Wars Connect, or Connect Star Wars, whatever you want to call it, gone are the days when these were part of the real Star Wars. Right now, we're swimming in a sea of mobile games and the upcoming Disney Infinity 3.0, with the figures and all, this being from 2.0, and we have the upcoming Star Wars Battlefront, but we really haven't had a large-scale Star Wars video game release since the canon change happened at this point. So how this will affect video game collectors is kind of up in the air. On the one hand, it gives you a defined endpoint and starting point if you're going to only go for the new canon, but there's been somewhat of a change of their approach. Lucasfilm is starting to have video games go through the story group just like novels and comics. But they've said that when they do so, they are checking the games for authenticity, not necessarily for canon. So, back in the Legends continuity, you would assume that a video game would go through the process of being vetted, and if it could fit within the Legends continuity, it was in. Like The Force Unleashed. Like the Battlefront games of old. But now there is some question. Video games have always been pliable to be playable. Game mechanics that may not make sense in-universe to make it be a fun game to play, whereas the actual game itself, maybe it's not continuity, maybe elements of it will be, thanks to the Holocron Continuity Database. Now, there's some question as to whether any video game will ever really be considered truly canon for the Star Wars universe, and not instead have elements brought over and have the argument made, well, it was authentic. It just wasn't canon. So, if you're looking for pure canon video games, that concept may no longer exist in Star Wars. Depends on where they go from here with this whole checking for authenticity line that they've been spouting for a while. The biggest question mark for collectors trying to find all the stories of Legends or canon or both has really come down to the games that aren't video games. Things from, among other places, for the most part, Fantasy Flight Games. For several years now, Fantasy Flight Games has been producing the Star Wars LCG Living Card Game, or Star Wars the Card Game. It's a great thing that's easy to collect because every pack you buy has the exact same cards. There are no booster packs and randomness built into their system. And it's been a line that has included a ton of expanded universe or Legends characters like Mara Jade. But it began before the canon change happened. So there's some question as to whether or not it's going to stick with Legends or not. And slowly but surely, Fantasy Flight Games seems to be leaning now towards including canonical elements, not just Legends elements, in their stories. Which begs the question, will it cross the line? Will it be a merging of the two? Will we see canon materials and Legends materials separated? Probably not. It seems that we're going to look for things for authenticity rather than for being a fit with a particular continuity is probably an approach being taken with these games as well. Meaning that maybe something gets mentioned in a card game, we can't take it for granted that it's in one continuity or another if it's interesting background information like we used to with things like the Decipher card game. Instead, it's kind of up in the air. It's authentic. But in what continuity, if any, is it real? The same goes for the RPG line from Fantasy Flight Games that just recently launched its third RPG, Force and Destiny, for Star Wars. Again, it was created and launched during the era in which Legends was the true continuity, so to speak. Now that canon's around, we see small elements of canon working their way into the game, but no real declaration of which continuity it's supposed to fit into. It has so much Legends, surely it isn't canon. But how could it be just Legends if there's no Legends label on it? Sure looks like it's being checked for authenticity only as well. But that makes sense, right? It's a game to play and have fun, not necessarily something being created as a source of legends or canon continuity material. We can't look at these games quite the same way as we used to look at the West End game stuff, for instance, as a source of valuable continuity knowledge. That's just not the approach being taken for a game anymore. Now, if you're into miniatures, Fantasy Flight Games has you hooked up tons of different ways. If you like miniatures games with figures, you've got Imperial Assault out there now. If you're into starship combat, you can check out X-Wing, which now has huge ships in the mix. Or perhaps scale it down a little bit and use capital ships in Armada. Same ship, different size here, where it's more about fleet battles than squadrons. But again, like the rest of Fantasy Flight Games, they drew heavily on legends for characters, situations, ships, and the like, only now they're starting to add canon elements into it as well, like the upcoming Ghost ship from Rebels being introduced into X-Wing. It appears that they're going for authenticity rather than one continuity or another. They are even creating some of their own new Star Wars materials, which is a first for Fantasy Flight Games when it comes to ships. When they realized that they didn't have a ship that was of comparable size to use to a Corellian Corvette for the X-Wing game for a huge ship, they created this bad boy, the Imperial Raider. It's a ship that is now inserted into Star Wars lore, whether for canon or legends, but a ship that didn't exist until Fantasy Flight Games created it to give themselves a new ship to be comparable to the Corvette. In fact, it's called a Raider-class Corvette. So they're sort of allowed to play with continuity and play with canon without having to really designate which one it falls into. What this means for a story collector is that some will feel, yes, I'm compelled to pick up these things because they are Star Wars, because there are character elements and such in them. But if you're really someone saying, I want all the canon stories, or I want all the legend stories, in a lot of ways you could really ignore the games at this point, whether video games or otherwise, because it certainly seems as though there really isn't that kind of delineation, and you're probably not going to wind up seeing something, say, from X-Wing locked down into legends or locked down into canon as something that is part of that story that's going to be referenced elsewhere. It's sort of a freeing aspect to those of us who are compelled to pick up all stories in all mediums, including games, because this is one less thing that becomes a compulsion to necessarily buy. But look, when it comes down to it, whether we're talking about books, comics, games, it really isn't about what I say. It's not about what Lucasfilm says. It's all a matter of personal preference. It always has been. If you're a Star Wars collector, what you collect is up to you. What gives you joy, what you have fun collecting, what chase you really enjoy participating in. And for some of us, that's novels. For some of us, that's toys. For some of us, that's games. For some, it's ornaments. The key thing is, it's about you and your enjoyment. Don't let this change of legends to canon stress you to the point where you can't enjoy it anymore. Don't let it break your fandom. It's a change, and we'll adapt or not as we choose to. Have fun with it. But if you're interested in Star Wars story collecting and haven't done it before, now, finally, it's your time. The window's open if you want to jump in, and we story collectors would love to have you. Thanks for watching, and congratulations again on the 10th anniversary, guys. Now back to Arnie and Marjorie.
Thanks for watching this video. You can see full episodes of Star Wars Action News with more collecting news and reviews at swactionnews.com. We also have thousands of toy and collectible photos in our photo gallery. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. May the pegs be stocked and the Force be with you.